If this, then that. .rgb to HSL, .value, source rect at time, semicolon, parentheses. What's going on? Let's learn about expression.
So the After Effects expression language is based on JavaScript, but with an extended set of built-in objects, according to the Adobe Help Desk. What that means is that you don't really need to know anything about programming, but if you have some experience with JavaScript, it might be a little bit easier to wrap your hand around. Let's say that we're starting completely from scratch. We know absolutely nothing about JavaScript or coding or programming in any way at all. This video will be for you because we're breaking down the basics. So a good source for help, besides watching YouTube tutorials and just playing around in the software yourself, is actually that Adobe Help Desk. So what I have up on screen now is just the expression section, and you can see that there's quite a lot of information in here about what expressions are, how they work, and even step-by-step guides from Adobe themselves. So I'll put this link in the description, but for now we'll pop over to After Effects and I'll just show off a couple basic use cases of expressions that we'll then put into action in the scene that we're building. So expressions are a tool to help you work in more clever ways in After Effects, and they can be used for a ton of different things. We're just looking at 3 basic use cases here. From left to right, we're going to be looking at the LoopOut expression, the time expression, and the wiggle expression. There are a million other ways of using expressions, and I'm sure we will probably get into other use cases as well along the lines. But we'll kick things off with just looking at these 3. So for the loop out, the purpose of even using it at all is to be able to create an animation once, then be able to loop it without needing to copy and paste a bunch of keyframes. So just to show you why you would want to use it at all, let's set some keyframes on the box on the left. Now, let's say that I just wanted this exact animation to continue throughout my entire composition, which is 10 seconds long. Your gut reaction before knowing about expressions might be to just take the keyframes and make sure you have your time indicator on the last one, Command-C, and then Command-V to copy and paste. And now we have the same animation happening again. Do the same thing at 4 seconds. Do the same thing at 6 seconds, and we're basically manually creating a looping animation of our keyframes by making sure that our keys are aligned to what we had before. So our animation itself is from 0 to 2 seconds, and then we're just copy and paste to fill up the entire timeline all the way to the end. The issue with doing this is that if you want to make any adjustment to the animation itself, like the position on the first second when the object moves down, maybe you don't want it to move all the way down, you just want it to move to here instead. So it goes from the top to this position, back to the top again. Now what we've done is we've taken the original 3 keyframes and just pasted them throughout our entire timeline. So when I scroll over here, we'll see this position is still at the bottom. Same thing over here, still at the bottom, because those are the original keyframes that we copied and pasted. So any updates that we make over here are not going to reflect on the overall animation, because there's no way for After Effects to know that what you intended to do was the change that you made here is something you wanted to be applied to the entire timeline. But that is exactly what we can solve by using the loop method instead. I'm just going to get rid of all of the keyframes except the first 3. So we have our top position, our bottom position, and our top position. And now, instead of selecting the keyframes and copying and pasting, I'm actually going to go over to the stopwatch over here that you use to turn on keyframing. And if you hold down Alt or Option and click on it, you'll see that we now have a new thing pop up, and it just says transform.position. Just click away and nothing's really going to be changing, but what you'll see is we have an expression applied now And the numbers over here have turned red to indicate that this position property of box 1 is now being controlled by an expression. Again, to further help you work with expressions, instead of having to write everything manually all the time, we do have a little pop-up arrow over here, just like we did for the shape layer modifiers. We can click on this and we can see that we get a bunch of menus in here, and we can just scroll through and we can see a bunch of complicated code that might look like you're falling into the matrix at the moment, but over time you'll be able to learn how these things are actually supposed to be used and what they all mean. Now, I'm going to be honest and say that I definitely do not know every single thing that this menu includes. I have a couple of expressions that I have basically memorized at this point because I use them so much, and they're fairly straightforward and fairly easy to work with. For the looping, we're going to write the word loop with small letters, and then we'll get a little pop-up menu here that actually helps us out in completing what After Effects thinks that we want to write. So it's kind of like autocorrect built into the expressions of After Effects. And I can just keep writing things manually, or I can use my arrow keys up and down to select the one that I'm interested in. Then in this case, I'm looking for loop out. I can just hit enter on my keyboard, and it's now going to apply that to my expression row. But I could just have easily just gone back and written the rest of it myself. And here I want to be careful about the case sensitivity. You can see that the word out is actually spelled with a capital O. So if I'm doing this manually, capital O, U-T, parentheses opened and closed is going to be completed automatically by After Effects. And in this case, I can just click away. Now, if I just keep scrolling on my time indicator to the right after my last keyframe, you'll see the object is still moving, even though I don't have any keyframes actually added here. What it's doing is it's using my 3 keyframes that I have over here. It's looking at those keyframes and saying, when we get to the final keyframe that's available here, we're going to loop out of this keyframe and just continue forever and ever and ever. And the nice thing about this is that now I can go back to my keyframe at 1 second, and I can move it back down to the very bottom of the screen. So it goes from here to here to here. And after my last keyframe is ended, at 3 seconds, it's now going to move it all the way down, exact same as this keyframe. And then at 4 seconds, it's going back up to this keyframe, 5 seconds back to this one, and so on and so on. What the loop out expression is doing is that it's looping out of the last keyframe, but there are a few different ways that it can loop out of the last keyframe. By default, it's using a setting called cycle. So technically what it's actually doing is inside of these parentheses, it's using a type which needs to be defined with quotation marks. And when I just do that, After Effects will give me a couple options in here for the looping options that are available. And like I mentioned, I just happen to know that the default one it's using is called cycle. So we'll just write that in. And this is not going to make any difference at all to what it's actually doing. But this is sort of what's happening behind the scenes. If we want to see visually what's going on here, what we can do is we can actually just go back to the beginning and we'll delete the very last keyframe. So now we just have 2 keyframes. We have our top position and we have our bottom position. And we just have 2 keyframes instead of 3, which means that you are now going to be looping out of this keyframe instead of the previous one. And by using the loop out cycle, what's now going to happen is that when I move past 1 second, it immediately jumps back to the original keyframe. So it's going back to this one, the frame directly after our last keyframe. In this case, that gives us a little bit of a weird pop because we've just set 2 keyframes for the top and the bottom, but we don't have a keyframe at 2 seconds anymore. So if we just wanted to play forward and then backward, forward and backwards, like this. And in this case, I have one that's named pretty perfectly because it's called Ping Pong. And that's exactly what we're looking to do. So select that one, just click away, and now it's going to ping pong from this keyframe back to this keyframe, back to that keyframe, back to that keyframe. So when I move past 1 second, you'll see that it now plays from here back to the top and then down again, to the top, down again, and like that forever and ever and ever by using the ping pong type instead of the cycle type. We'll leave the loop out expression here for now. There are other types, there are other ways of using the loop to do a loop in, and you can loop a certain set of keyframes, so you're not looping all of the keyframes on a layer, but all that stuff is a little bit too advanced to cover in this intro to expressions, but we will cover that in many more tutorials in the future. For the time expression, we'll look at the middle one over here, and we'll use rotation to make this one make a little bit more sense. So if I just wanted this object to rotate during my scene, I could set a keyframe over here, I can move to the very end, and I can just turn up the rotation like this. I can go back and hit play, and I can look at that and say, oh, it's actually moving a little bit too slow, I want it to move faster. Make it move faster, what I need to do is go to my last keyframe and turn up the rotation value, because I only have 2 keyframes, one at the very start, one at the very end. What's going to define the speed that the object is rotating is the amount that it's rotating from keyframe number 1 to keyframe number 2 in the amount of time that I have available, which in this case is 10 seconds because that's the length of my composition. So I turn that up a little bit, and I can play again, and I can say, well, it's still moving too slowly. And this can be an annoying way of working where really all you want to do is rotate this object at a certain speed throughout the entire composition. So I'll go back to the beginning and I'll just click the stopwatch, and that will get rid of all of my keyframes. So I have no keyframes applied at all. We will instead apply an expression. So we won't even set a single keyframe for this layer. We will just animate it purely using expressions. We'll go ahead and Alt click or Option click on the stopwatch, and we'll just write the word time. Again, After Effects helps me spell it out so I can confirm that, okay, the word time is actually something that exists inside of After Effects. So I'll hit enter to write the word time, and I'll just click away, and I'll move my time indicator throughout this entire thing. And if you're just looking up here, you may not see much of a difference in your eyes over here to the expression or the rotation value. So if I scrub through again and just look at the number here, you'll see that it is in fact moving from 0 to a higher number. And if you are a little bit careful about looking at the timeline at the same time, you'll see that at 1 second, we have a rotation value of 1. At 2 seconds, we have a rotation value of 2. At the very end, the time is going to be set at 10. We have a rotation value of 10. So this gives you a little bit of an insight into what's actually happening. It's taking the time value of the composition and applying that to our rotation. So I can say time times or time multiplied by a number. And in this case, I'm just going to write the number 10. So if you click C over here, you'll see we have a rotation of 1 degree. But when I click away here, so it applies the time times 10 expression, this value will change. So we'll click away, and now it's set to 10. And at 2 seconds, it's going to be set to 20. So it's taking the time or a composition, multiplying that by 10. Maybe that's still too slow. I can say multiplied by 100. And now it's rotating faster, or multiplied by 500. And now it's rotating way faster than it did before. And I'm able to just control this using a time multiplied by a number instead of keyframes that I can control this way. The last one we'll have a look at is the wiggle expression. And again, for box over here on the right, we will use rotation. Option or Alt click on the stopwatch. You know this at this point, it's going to say transform.rotation. That is something we want to replace with something else. In this case, we're using the wiggle expression. What the wiggle expression does is it allows you to give some random movement to an object instead of setting keyframes. So it's very good for adding a little bit of subtle organic movement, or something like very extreme camera shake if there's an explosion or an earthquake happening. The wiggle expression is going to be your friend here. So I'm going to write the word wiggle. Again, it helps me out a little bit and gives me wiggle, open parentheses, close parentheses. But in this case, After Effects does actually need a little bit more information. And the basic version of the way that you need to write the wiggle expression is going to be two values inside of the parentheses. So what the wiggle expression is looking for is it's looking for a frequency, which is going to mean the number of times per second that this object is wiggling. And the second number is going to be the amplitude. So really what you're doing is writing wiggle frequency, comma, amplitude. This is what you want to put inside of the parentheses, but obviously not with the words. You need to define this with numbers, but just to explain the logic of the way that this thing works. So if I wanted to wiggle 1 time per second, I'm going to replace the word frequency with the number 1, like this. And if I wanted to wiggle 10 or 20 or 30 or 100, that is what I'm going to put instead of the word amplitude. In this case, I'm going to say 10, like so. And at this point, I can click away. And you'll see we now have a random number over here. Yours might not be, say, 2.8, but yours is going to say a random number in the range of the values that we've defined here. So 1 time per second, this rotation is going to wiggle 10 on the amplitude. And I can just scrub through and see, again, we picked 2 small numbers, so not a whole lot looks like it's going on. Let's change that to 1, 100. And we're now getting some more random movement, and change that to be 10, 100. And you'll see that it's now wiggling way more. And I can now go to the very beginning and I can hit play and I can watch all 3 of my beautiful animations that we've done. I can just reveal the expressions in my timeline for all 3 layers, and from left to right we now have a loop out with 2 keyframes using a ping pong type. So it's going from keyframe 1 forwards to keyframe 2, backwards to keyframe 1, forwards to keyframe 2, and it's doing that animation looping in a fashion forever and ever and ever. In the middle, we're using the time expression to control the rotation of our box, and we're saying that we're using the time of the composition multiplied by 500, which makes it spin 500 times faster than the numbers defined in our composition length. And finally, on the right, we have our wiggle expression that we just did that is now wiggling 10 times per second at an amplitude of 100.